Our first speaker is Graham Cairns. Graham, as you can see, has a lovely backdrop behind him with a beautiful Brisbane River. And his manual is Presentation Mastery, and it's on persuasive speaking. And this is an interesting topic. It's called Scotty versus Geordi, which is life lessons for the future. His time is going to be 5 to 7 minutes. So, Mr. Timer, could we have a green on 5, a yellow on 6, and a red on 7? Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause for Graham Cairns. Scotty versus Geordi, life lessons from the future.
Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters and guests. I may have mentioned in the past that I am a science fiction fan. In fact, I am more than a science fiction fan. I am a geek. And I am particularly a geek where it comes to Star Trek. I like all variations of Star Trek, from the very latest, which is Star Trek Discovery, through to the original Star Trek, the original series, all sorts of Star Trek. But there's something that's a recurrent theme through all versions of Star Trek, and that is the chief engineer, which is an important role. And the two most famous, in Star Trek terms, chief engineers are Montgomery Scott, who is the old-style Scottish engineer. If he were in a steamship, you would expect to smell the coal and see the grease under his fingertips. And then there's Geordi LaForge, the modern version of an engineer. He's a button down, and if he says something can be done, it can be done, and if he says something cannot be done, then it cannot be done, as opposed to Montgomery Scott, who, as I say, is the old school miracle worker. The interesting thing about this is that there's a different worldview from those two engineers, which is important to us as trainers. Let me explain why. Scotty has a reputation as a miracle worker. He says, look, we cannot change the laws of physics, but then he goes ahead and changes them anyway. He gets things to happen despite the fact that he tells people that they can't. And at one stage, he explains to Geordi what that's all about. Through the magic of television, he manages to meet up with Geordi LaForge, who is 100 years later in the time than him. But anyway, he says, you can't tell the captain of a starship what he wants, because they're like children. They want everything now. You've got to lie. You've got to say that it will take 4 times as long. That's how you get a reputation as a miracle worker. And that's, you know, humorous, haha, funny, yes, but there are some real world ramifications here that I'd like you to think about. Which would you, as a trainer, rather be thought of? As a miracle worker or as a plotter? Somebody who can do these amazing things, or somebody who just does what they're supposed to do? Which would you prefer to be thought of? Yeah, okay. Most of us would like to think of ourselves as being a Scotty. We'd like to be the miracle worker. We don't want to be thought of as a plotter. But imagine that you're the boss. Which would you prefer? Somebody who lies to your face so that they can look good, or somebody who tells you what you need to know even if you don't want to know it? Which is easier to plan for, you have to ask. I have to tell you, if I were a boss, I would much rather have a Geordi, somebody who is responsible, rather than somebody who tells me what I want to know, or at least makes me think that they can do something extraordinary. There's a lot of discussion of this on the internet because, well, gee, here's a surprise. There are a lot of people on the internet who are, like me, Star Trek geeks. Projectmanagementhacks.com, and I'll put the link to this up, to this particular article up in the notes, has a really interesting discussion on this. In one section on Scotty being a miracle worker, the author says, building up your reputation as a miracle worker is one of the skills that hardly anyone talks about. It's not something that you see in study guides, but it is much easier to over-deliver on your projects when you manage expectations by pretending to be a miracle worker like Scotty. It's also important to observe that Scotty doesn't need to be the master of every technical skill in order to be successful. So let's unpack that a little bit. It's easier to over-deliver if you're holding stuff back. The flip side of that is, I could probably do more, but this will do. Now, if you are an employer looking to hire a trainer, which sort of trainer would you prefer to be hiring? In another episode, Scotty says, well, a good engineer should always be a wee bit conservative, at least on paper. Now, this is a valid point. As trainers, we have to be aware that people will come and go on long-term projects. With this awareness in mind, documenting project deliverables becomes even more important. Otherwise, how would your project be delivered on time when your project team changes? So it's important that you be conservative, but that doesn't mean that you should lie to your clients. Here's another problematic example. In the episode Relics, Scotty and LaForge are working together to restore a damaged spaceship to full operation. Scotty says, shunt the deuterium from the main crypto pump to the auxiliary tank. And Geordi responds, but the tank can't withstand that kind of pressure. Oh, where'd you get that idea? Well, it's in the impulse engine specifications. What, regulation 4215, pressure variances on IRC tank storage? Yes. To which Scotty says, forget about it. I wrote that bit. Now, by showing that he wrote the key engineering specifications, we're supposed to think, well, Scotty is demonstrating his authority here. We're supposed to accept that he's the expert. And we'd all like to be thought of as the expert. But consider this. In the decades since Scotty wrote the book, deliberately building slack into the figures so that miracle workers could coax a little bit out, I wonder how many other engineers have faced disaster because they believed that book. At what cost? Hubris, I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen. Hubris. I know we're talking about a TV show here. This is not reality. But I would ask you to consider that lesson anyway. Is our willingness to fudge, to try to convince clients that we are miracle workers, actually ripping them off? And more importantly, are we actually ripping off those people that we're supposed to be training? And have you ever worked with one of those miracle workers who kept stuff in reserve? How did you feel about that, about knowing that you were being played? Or have you ever pitched a training proposal to a client knowing that you could be offering more, but you want to keep something in reserve? How do you reckon those clients would feel if they knew that? I guess the question I'm asking, when I ask, are you a Scotty or a Geordi, is it ethical to do this? It's worth noting, by the way, in that earlier exchange that I talk about, where Scotty told Geordi to lie, because that's how reputations are built, Geordi turns to the old school engineer, waits a beat and says, I've got a job to do and you are in my way. Now that was harsh, probably fair. So think about that, ladies and gentlemen. Think about the ethics of this. But before I go, I do have one final Scotty-Geordi comparison. In an original series episode, Captain Kirk says to Scotty, what are you doing? Reading another technical journal, Scotty? Aye, I am, Captain. Don't you ever relax? Yes, I am relaxing, Captain. Now, that's a particularly obvious example of something that is spread right throughout all of the Star Trek episodes. Geordi in The Next Generation, Trip on Star Trek Enterprise, O'Brien in Deep Space Nine, Torres in Voyager. In all iterations of Star Trek, the engineers relax by reading the latest journals in their field. Maybe as trainers, that's something we should be looking to emulate as well. Mr. Facilitator.